Hi, and welcome to Technology Rants. This is Mario Rodriguez, Networker MX, and I have the pleasure and honor to have with us the one and only Jeff Doyle. Thank you for having us today. It's to me, it's a complete honor to have you.
Well, thanks, and thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
All right, and so the reason why I made this interview with you is that sometimes we know the technology, we know the author, and we know all their contribution, but we don't know the person. For instance, their Cisco Press biography is quite short in sense that it says only CCIE 1919, professional service engineer and IPv6 solution manager, specialized in IP routing protocols, MPLS, and IPv6. Jeff has designed or assisted in the design of large-scale carrier and service provider networks in North America, Europe, and Asia. But can you tell us more about yourself, please?
Sure. I've been in networking since oh gosh, probably the late 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
So for a long time, which is obvious from all the gray hair. I maybe I'll get into how I actually got into networking a little bit later because I know you've got a question related to that. Um, but um, I think the thing about myself um, that probably says a lot about my career is that I get bored really easy, and so I always am looking for what's the newest thing, the most interesting thing to be pursuing. So I learning all of my basics happened back in the early 1990s, I think. Maybe before that, I was a Cisco instructor at that time, traveling mostly in the U.S., but regularly teaching all of the Cisco classes that they had back then, which were not that many at the time. But that was huge fun. And once I sort of got myself established, um, the rest of my career, like I said, has really been chasing, what's new and what's interesting in the industry. So in the late 1990s, that meant talking. I was very interested in IPv6. I sort of stumbled into that, but my joke at the time was that if you wanted to talk to anybody about IPv6, you had to sit on an airplane for 12 hours first because the only people that were interested were in Asia. So I spent a lot of time traveling around Asia, making speeches about IPv6, doing consulting about it, and all of that. Early 2000s, at the time, what was really interesting there was MPLS. And network consolidation. And so spent a lot of time, I was with Juniper Networks during that period, spent a lot of time traveling around talking about network consolidation and triple play networks, which you almost never hear anybody using that term anymore. But nevertheless, that was what was new and interesting then. Around maybe 2010, 2011, suddenly where everything had been happening in service provider networks and the WAN, everything kind of changed suddenly, and all the interesting things seemed to be happening in the data center. Data centers had always been just kind of stodgy, just firewalls and basic three-tier switching hierarchies and that sort of thing. But just all of the social media, streaming entertainment, and all that sort of thing drove huge changes suddenly to data centers. Financial markets were another big driver. And with that interest in data centers came an interest in SDN. And so spent a lot of time talking to customers about SDN and all of that sort of thing, and sort of a natural evolution from that in around maybe 2016, 2017, somewhere in there, was intent-based networking. And got very interested in that. And that landed me finally where I am now, which is at a company called Apstra. And intent-based networking is what we do. I got very lucky there. I was developing a lot of interest in IBM, and the president of Apstra was an old friend of mine. So I sent him an email one day saying, if you could ever use somebody like me. And 3 weeks later, I was working there.
Yeah.
So anyway, a long story to say that's sort of the arc of what I've been doing across my career.
All right. So, yeah, going a little back in that case, while you were studying on your own, or even in your early years of your career, because as you're telling me, you've been more involved into a lot of projects, and you've seen the changes in technology, and you've seen the evolution in technology. What took you to go and become an author, to write a book or a series of books?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting. I sort of stumbled into it, believe it or not. I've throughout my college years, and well, really going all the way back to high school, I've been a history buff, and I also enjoy literature. So I do a lot of reading. And one of the motivations behind enjoying history is that I really enjoy understanding the background stories of whatever's going on in the world, or whatever thing I'm interested in. And I think that has influenced a lot of the way I write. So I mentioned that I was a Cisco instructor in the early 1990s, and I always thought, I'm enjoying this so much. I'm enjoying the technology so much. Someday I would love to be writing some books about it. And I thought, well, maybe the first step is to start by trying to get some articles published. Wrote one article for a publication that existed at the time called Cisco World, that was still a paper publication. I'm sure they're long out of existence, on how to design access lists, which sounds pretty mundane now, but back then in 1994, maybe, that was still one of those things that a lot of people wondered about. I can never get my access lists to work the way I want. So I wrote that article, and based on that one article, Cisco Press actually contacted me and said, "We liked your article. Would you like to write a book?"
Wow.
Yeah, and at the time they were a new publication. In fact, it was not just Cisco Press. McGraw-Hill also approached me, and same thing. You want to write a book? And I chose Cisco Press because at the time they had only one book out, and it was one of my favorite books at the time, which was Sam Halabi's book on BGP. First book they had ever done, and just he explains BGP so well in that book, and I was so impressed. I thought I'd really like to write for them. So I accepted. I said yes, I would love to write a book, and I said, "What do you want me to write about?" And they said, "Well, anything you choose." And so I just sort of grabbed the big prize and said, I'd love to write about routing TCP/IP. It pretty much went from there. That I put in a book proposal. The original proposed book was supposed to be about 500 words, 500 pages, 500 to 600 pages. And I got about, well, not even a quarter of the way through what I was proposing, and realized, by the time I'm halfway through, this is going to be a 1,000-page book. So that turned into a 2-volume book, and I've been pleased that people still like them. They're still Still selling pretty well. I get a pretty nice royalty check every month, which is unusual for a technical book.
Nice. Did you imagine at some point that it was going to be, I mean, I guess it's fair to say that it's the go-to book for the CCIE candidates ever since. And did you imagine that it's going to happen that way?
I had no idea that it would happen that way. I wrote it strictly for me. You know, that thinking, you know, if I were going to buy a book to study for CCIE, what would I want? And wrote the book entirely from that perspective. You know, and I was really surprised at how popular it was. And keep in mind that in the mid 1990s, CCIE was the only, it was a new certification from Cisco, and it was the only certification Cisco had. So if you look at the book, you know, I mean, I start the first few chapters with what's the difference between a router and a switch, and, you know, how do you subnet IPv4 addresses, and all those kinds of really basic things that go into basic certifications now. But at the time, there was nothing else. So I wrote it from the idea that you know, going from having very minimal network knowledge to getting a CCIE, and so that's paid off apparently.
Were you a CCIE when you wrote that book?
Yes.
All right. Then.
I think I had, yeah, well, yeah, I definitely was, because there's even some advice in the first edition. I'm not sure if it's in the second edition or not, but in the first edition, there's some advice in the appendix on, you know, how to study for the CCIE, how to, you know, mentally prepare yourself for it and all that. That's probably mostly outdated now, because the exam is so different now than it was when I took it.
Right. So this is from my perspective, and I'm talking from my complete ignorance about the subject. I mean, basically, when you know something, something about a topic, and you say, I want, or I can write a book about it. I can write a book about it, but there has to be some structure. I mean, how did you get to know the structure and how to properly write a book?
Sure. Oh, and I think I actually started to go down that road a moment ago, and then I lost track, which is typical of me. I mentioned that I love history,
right,
and you know, and I like to understand the background of anything that's going on. So if you want to, you know, read about the American Civil War, you know, well, what is really interesting is, well, what were all the politics and, you know, and the social conditions and everything that led up to that, that really helps you understand, you know, that event itself. And I write from that same perspective for technical books, of not just, you know, here's OSPF and how OSPF works, but what's the background of that? What, you know, what were sort of the predecessors that led up to OSPF? In volume 2, where I talk so much about BGP, you know, there's a whole chapter that begins with, well, what were the predecessors of BGP? The idea being, you know, what worked and what didn't work, and to me, that puts a lot more context around what I'm saying. The other piece for me is, like I said, I'm a literature. I've always read literature, and I feel like the really important thing is understanding how to tell a story. I'm not necessarily all that good at it, but I think it's so important for being able to create a book that people enjoy, is being as conversational as you can, trying to be funny where you can, you know, just little distracting, entertaining things like, you know, all of my books, the routers all have some silly names, you know, it's just, you know, something that might make the reader smile a little bit. You know, but I mean, it's very dry material. So anything you can do to make it a little less dry and a little bit easier to read, I think is important.
Right. Do you have, you're totally right on that, because sometimes it's when you are a participant on a class, it's very difficult because you just don't have to like concentrate and focus on the class. We have the life going on, work life and the house and everything. So when you go to a boot camp or when you go to a class or courses, it becomes really difficult for the people that's going there.
Yeah.
So, do you have a routine while you're writing a book? Like you have a routine of how many pages you want to write per day, or you have like a goal set, a goal to
Uh,
set?
I should, and I don't. I have to say, I'm a very undisciplined writer. Um, I tend to just fit it in wherever I can during my day. When I was writing the TCP/IP books, I was a lot younger, obviously, and basically my writing routine would be, you know, after the family had all gone to sleep, I would start writing about 10 o'clock in the evening and work till maybe 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, can't do that anymore. I've just gotten too old, and I'm not as alert anymore. And so nowadays it's more just trying to fit it in as I can. Most any writer of any kind of books will tell you, you know, you should have that discipline. You know, set aside a certain number of hours during the day that is dedicated to nothing but writing. You know, whether it's an hour, whether it's the entire morning, or you know, whatever. You should always set aside some time so that you're just sitting down, and even if you can't think of what you want to be writing about at the time, you're still, you know, in front of the screen and just start writing something. And I think it's great advice, and I've never followed it.
Okay. Well, that's I work for you in the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, uh, in average, back in the day, how long does it take to complete a book from start to finish?
A book, the Routing TCP/IP books, each probably took a year and a half to do. And that's writing very regularly on it. I have lots of friends who are authors, and they all say the same thing about the first book they ever did. Is I had no idea how much work it was. And you know, so if you're writing a book, especially a book in this industry, to make money, it's not profitable financially at all for the time investment you have. Where it's profitable is obviously just in you know, creating your own validation and you know, showing people that you know what you're talking about. And you know, not all books will do that for you, but it's really about what can go on your bio and in your resume and that sort of thing. And that's where it's really beneficial.
Totally. So, in your career, you tell me that you've been going through a lot of different technologies and you've been an instructor as well.
Yeah.
So, is there a topic that you find particularly challenging to teach or particularly challenging to learn?
Um, for me, it's probably what I'm doing right now, which is network automation and network programmability.
Yeah.
And I mentioned, you know, working for Apstra and working with intent-based networking. Um, Everything I've done throughout my career is pretty much, you know, you have a router or a switch, and you get on the CLI, and you understand the protocols, you understand how to program those. But with intent-based networking and more broadly with automation and programmability, it's all about the software and speaking to devices through the API and all of that sort of thing. Um, And that's something very new for me. I've never really been in a software-only environment before. Never worked for a software-only company before I joined Apstra. And so just for me, understanding software development processes and all of those kinds of things has been a challenge, but something that is enjoyable to me because I enjoy a challenge. And you know, and I've written a book, it's a small marketing book, intent-based networking for dummies, that I wrote for Apstra, and I've gotten a lot of compliments on it, saying, you know, oh, you explained this really well, you know, these really complex topics. You know, you've broken them down into something that's really simple and understandable, and that pleases me because I feel like that's what my real talent is not so much that I'm particularly smart about anything, it's that I can explain things really well.
That's really good. So just as a brief thing, can you give us, that would be an excellent opportunity, if you can explain to the most of the audience, as myself, I've been also working on networking exclusively. I've been I'm still trying to get my MPLS and my BGP in straight, and now you bring me the programmability, it's like a lot. So for the people that doesn't have that much experience on software and all that, can you give us like a briefing on that, so we can know what to expect and what to do?
Sure. You know, you read more and more that, you know, if you're getting certified in networking these days, you should be proficient, you know, maybe not proficient, but at least know enough about programming, you know, particularly Python. You know, there's other languages, you know, Go from Google and some things like that that are useful, but it seems like almost everybody writes in Python now. And you find a lot of advice saying, you know, you should at least be able to know enough about Python to be able to create functionality that you want to create, or, you know, and you should know a little bit about Ansible and that sort of thing. And I very much agree with that. You know, as far as how to build a background, as far as specific to intent-based networking that I'm doing now, it's something that right now, at least with Apstra, it's very data center oriented, but you know, there are a lot of other aspects of the industry where IBN can apply and does apply in some other applications. But the whole idea is that we're starting to move away from touching individual boxes for doing any kind of configuration. And what that means in turn is maybe moving away from knowing individual CLIs. So, you know, I'm not going to say you don't need to know it, but moving away from, you know, I know how to use Cisco IOS or NXOS. I know how to use Juniper Junos. I know how to use Arista EOS. I know how to use Cumulus, which is a very different animal from all of those other things. With intent-based networking, you're actually putting a different kind of management interface on top of everything. And the standard way to describe IBN is that you just dictate what you want, and the algorithmic declarative language of IBN translates what you want into how to do it, and it can translate it for any kind of operating system that's down at the physical layer. You know, so if, you know, just speaking in terms of what we do, you know, within a data center, I want I need a VLAN for this particular application or this particular corporate entity or whatever to appear on these interfaces across these switches in my data center. On this particular VLAN, I need to connect all of those VLANs at the forwarding level with VXLAN, and then manage all that at the control plane level with BGP EVPN. Saying just that piece involves a hugely complex workflow to configure your data center switches to do just that. But with IBN, it'll do it all for you, and it'll translate it to a bunch of different languages. So if you happen to have Cisco Nexus in your network, and you also have some Arista boxes in your network, maybe you have some Juniper QFX switches in your network in the data center, IBN will take care of translating what you wanted into all of those individual languages, and it pushes it down to those boxes via APIs. So you get completely away from CLIs and touching individual boxes.
So regardless of the iOS that the device has, you just enter like, okay, for instance, thinking I'm a little bit more simple, like I have these 5 routers that I want to work on OSPF, and I want to give them like this area and this and all that. And regardless of the brand, there's going to be fully configured on the same platform, the same like dashboard. You just, with a couple of clicks, or one way to say it, and it's going to be completed.
Absolutely, that's exactly it. So it's basically looking at your entire network, your entire data center switching infrastructure as a single entity rather than individual nodes. So you're configuring it consistently across the whole thing. And looking at one example of a real small feature is if you're familiar with Junos, something I think I mentioned earlier, I worked for Juniper for a long time, and a feature that was very popular when Junos first came out was rollback. You know, I deploy something to my network and I'm not happy with it, or it breaks something or whatever, and I can instruct the box, roll back to this previous configuration. We can do the same thing at Apstra. And sorry, I really didn't intend for this to turn into a sales pitch at all, but
don't worry.
We can do the same thing at Apstra, except across whatever vendor you have in your network, and do it on all rather than go to this box and do a rollback, go to this box and do a rollback, go to this box, do a rollback. We just do the whole network. So you deploy something like I was talking about with an EVPN element to it, and it's something very complex, and maybe you decide this is not working the way I wanted it, and I want to go back to a previous configuration. You can do that very simply by rolling back, and it will roll back your entire network to something before you did the deployment.
Wow. So it's huge when you think about it.
Yeah. And that's really why I'm here, because I feel like that IBN is just in its infancy, really. I think there's just a huge potential for completely changing the way we operate networks. Yeah.
I have one question just came from the top of my head now that you're talking about this. What happens if that that overlay, for one way to say, that handles that manages the whole system, breaks? I mean, the network is working, the network is okay, but that thing breaks. Then you cannot manage the whole thing as you used to, or as you're supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of, when you say the network is still functioning, but the overlay breaks, which, in my opinion means that, well, the network is, even if your routers and switches and everything are still running there, if the overlay isn't working, then, then obviously you've got serious problems. One of the advantages of intent-based networking is that you should never have something that rolls out that's then going to break. At least in what we do, we have validators in the software that when you say, I I want to do this in my network, whatever this happens to be. The validators will actually check that against reference designs, best practice reference designs, which is a big part of what I do at Apstra is help make these